If I speak this loud, can you hear me? Is that fine? A little bit of background first. I know that most academics are Johnny-come-latelys to this issue. I'm actually an academic because of the issue. I've been a vegan since I was about 15 years old, and my interest in animal issues is what drove me to do philosophy and also to do the activist work I'm engaged in. So I work at both a grassroots level and a national level. I do research for PETA. I work in grassroots groups, both in my hometown in San Diego and in Virginia, where I'm at. And I also write on these issues at an academic level because I think there's important things to be said philosophically and theoretically that need to be debated. So one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly today is simply animal liberation's relation to other movements such as environmentalism. This wouldn't be the only one, but just one of the ones to highlight. So, any of you in here study philosophy at all? A little bit. I assume you know Singer and Reagan? Okay, good enough. That's all we need to know. I'm trained not in that tradition. In philosophy, that's considered the so-called analytic tradition. These are the logic choppers, the people who are very hyper-analytic and break everything down. I'm actually a student. Have you heard of Jacques Derrida, the guy with the big white head of hair? Heard of him? Anybody? Yeah, a couple. I studied with Derrida, so I'm in a slightly different tradition. I'm sympathetic to that tradition as well as the tradition that Marty Keel represents, feminist theory and care ethics. So I'll be offering a kind of different theoretical base for the issues that I'm talking about. So if there's anything I say, it sounds like mumbo jumbo, just let me know. I'll translate it. I've tried to keep all jargon out of the paper, so it shouldn't take more than 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have some discussion. So contemporary animal liberationist discourses and practices face several important challenges at both an institutional and at a theoretical level. Today I would like to speak about one of those challenges in some detail, specifically the problem of animal liberation and its others. By others, I'm referring to certain problematic and questionable limits that have been created by the internal logic and metaphysical commitments of animal liberation. In other words, its underlying philosophical and normative commitments. In particular, I would like to discuss animal liberation's relation to its environmental other, in other words, environmental ethics and politics. This limit, in particular, has important theoretical and practical consequences, and I argue that this limit and other similar limits that are inherent to animal liberation derive from a particular understanding of the ground of animal ethics and politics. In other words, what's at stake in animal ethics? What are we here for? What are we talking about? Strictly speaking, it seems to be some kind of suffering subject or some kind of subject of a life if you're in the Reagan or Singer camp. Now, before discussing this issue in more detail, let me lay out where my normative stance is. I am a supporter of animal liberation, animal rights of the standard variety. I'm also a supporter of animal liberation in the more militant variety. So I work with Tony, I work with Stephen Best, and I think that you can offer good arguments on behalf of militant animal activism. Where does my normative grounding come from? I don't borrow it from Peter Singer and Tom Reagan. I think that their frameworks are useful strategically to some extent, but I think they're problematic for this. So let me lay out briefly where I'm coming from and give you some sense of what the argument I'll be making. So my normative stance is pluralist. In other words, I would employ several kinds of ethical theories. I don't think you need to have one. Philosophers want one because they're all what you call monists. They want clean, ethical theories. So I'm a pluralist. I'm also a situationist. I don't think you can take a theory and impose it on any given situation. You have to look at a particular situation. Your ethics derive from that. If somebody were to press me to ask for what the ground of animal ethics is, in other words, where it comes from, I would locate it in what Emmanuel Levinas is a famous French philosopher. I would locate it in what Emmanuel Levinas calls the face of the earth. Levinas uses the term face figuratively or metonymically, if you like that term better, to draw attention to the way in which a sense of obligation is aroused by the expression of vulnerability and finitude in sentient beings in particular, a vulnerability that's most easily seen and expressed by an actual face but could be expressed elsewhere. So in Levinas, this could be the wrinkles of somebody's skin. He talks about the nape of a neck. In other words, it's where people are vulnerable, and it's their vulnerability that calls you outside of yourself in order to help them. While Levinas himself, a famous philosopher, is a bit equivocal about whether or not this kind of ethics extends and this vulnerability extends to animals, if you read his work carefully, it's clear that the basic framework could be extended to include animals. We'll return to that in just a moment. In brief, the ground of ethics, as I am going to present it here and talk to you about, would lie in a response to the otherness of an animal, or an otherness of any other kind of being for that matter, and the vulnerability of that animal, or the vulnerability of that other being, and their ability to interrupt one's egoism and complacency. So ethics begins when one's complacency is called into question. Ethics, thus, has its ground in the other's call upon me and not in my self-reflection. So if you know anything about the philosophical tradition, typically they want to ground ethics in the self. self-reflection, rationality, etc. Here, ethics is located outside of the self, in the call of the other, or in the obligations one feels toward the other. Given these conditions, given the fact that ethics doesn't originate with me, but originates outside of me, it seems reasonable to me to accept the fact that no one ethical theory will capture the full scope of ethical life, and that no ethical theory can exhaust the experiences that give rise to responsibility, because there's multiple experiences that give rise to responsibility. This should not be taken to suggest that we should give up on ethical theorizing altogether. Rather, it suggests that a modest and flexible pluralism is a fitting response to the difficulties inherent in coming to grips with responsibility. Now, philosophers will want to say, why in the hell should I respond to anybody who's suffering? Philosophers actually ask this question and demand an answer for it. Why should I care about suffering? Most of us don't ask that, and most of us don't need an answer for it. Philosophically speaking, I think if somebody asks that question, I don't think it's possible to give an answer to it. No proposed answer to this question will meet the challenge of a radical skeptic or the kind of ethical egoist who says, give me a reason for why I should care. So, I am rather less sanguine about efforts to use demonstrative ethical theories, in other words, theories that are rationally and logically grounded, such as Tom Reagan's and Peter Singer's. What they're trying to do, I don't know if you have read their books super carefully, but they believe that their ethical theories and the ones that they're laying out for you are not just good for animal ethics. They think they're the best ethical theories, period, in as much as they're the most rational ones. And they believe that any rational being would adhere to this kind of ethical theory that they do. I don't think that's why their books are very convincing or very successful. To my mind, the strength and influence of their approaches is not to be attributed to the fact that they're logic and rational and can convince people along those grounds. Rather, I would say they have a certain kind of what you call dialectical appeal. In other words, they start with beliefs that most people share and they stretch them. In other words, they're moral extensionists. Now, that's not what they intend to do, but I think that's why their work is popular and influential. So, put simply, I would suggest that Singer, Reagan, and others of this camp have had tremendous success in getting their messages across, primarily because their ethical theories appeal to and logically extend widely held moral theories. So, my orientation is somewhat different than these folks, and I do not mean to say that I'm opposed to this approach. I think it's useful as a strategy, and I would not recommend doing away with it. On the contrary, I share with these guys, Singer, Reagan, and others, an approach to an animal ethics and a commitment to move toward maximal respect toward animals, and also a commitment to confront the unjust treatment and exploitation of animals in various institutions and practices. So the key difference between what I'm going to lay out here and these guys is not so much in a particular decision or strategy. Typically, I'm in line with them. I would show up at the same rallies and probably make the same decisions. Rather, where I think the problem lies is the underlying normative framework and the philosophical commitments and the implications of that philosophical commitment. What I want to argue here is that the orientation of both philosophical and mainstream animal ethics and politics is too narrowly constrained, and it's constrained by this philosophical framework that I'm going to look at more carefully. So, the modern European tradition, let me talk briefly about that and why I think it's important. For those of you who don't know anything about the academy and how it works, jobs are decided along the lines of which camp you belong in. Currently, the analytic camp dominates. The modern European camp is a kind of marginalized group of philosophers who can't find jobs and basically have to fight for tenure and things like that. However, this tradition of doing philosophy has some pretty interesting things to say, and I think about animal ethics in particular. So, the modern European tradition considers Anglo-American philosophy, the dominant form of doing philosophy, to be somewhat naive in its rejection of cultural and historical analyses of important philosophical issues. The analytic tradition considers continentalists to be not logical enough and not rational enough. I do not wish to take sides in this debate, for I believe it is largely a pseudo-debate created and maintained by professional philosophers who wish to guard jealousy to a particular philosophical orientation. But what I do want to suggest here is that animal liberation, which is grounded in this Anglo-American analytic logical tradition, has something to benefit by looking for other sources. Marty Keel has done similar work along these lines by looking to the feminist tradition for other sources. I'm going to suggest the modern European tradition as resources. Now, I'm going to return to that in just a moment. I have a slightly different audience than I thought, so I'll just hop around and talk about something. We'll talk about that in more detail briefly. But basically, let me just sum this up in a nutshell so we can make this quick. What modern European philosophers do is they displace what you'd call a subject, a self, or an agent. Okay, so everybody familiar with talk about subjectivity and agency and all that? Does that sound like familiar terms? So, okay. Making decisions, being self-aware. Analytic philosophy places a premium on that notion of the subject. Continental philosophy displaces that notion of the subject, and it says that what grounds thought, what grounds ethics, what grounds practice, what grounds politics is not self-consciousness, but responsivity to others, the kind of motif I just talked about in Levin's. I think that animal liberation